Hey, what's going on everyone? So I'm super excited to bring you this video. As you know, I've been testing out the PowerKitty X18S on a range of console systems, and one of them in particular, GameCube, was pretty demanding. Now some games worked really well, and there were others that just felt like it needed better hardware. Now, as I noted in those earlier videos, I was testing this on the default emulator settings, so I decided to go back, change some settings around to see if I could improve the performance, and I was really surprised by what I found. Games that had slowdown like Wind Waker now ran those sections without slowdown, and other games that barely ran before like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance and Need for Speed Underground were now suddenly playable. In this video, I'll give you the best settings for 10 games in MMJR, and hopefully that will give you a bit of a guide as to what settings to adjust so that you can do that for the games that you're interested in. Now, this video doesn't only apply to the PowerKitty X18S, you can do this for other systems as well. So if you have the upcoming Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, you can try these settings on that as well. In my video looking at GameCube performance, I tested 32 games, and I noted that there were a number of games that worked okay and some games that were not working. Okay games meant they played okay, but there were sections with slowdown that players would have to struggle through. Games that were not working were games that were way too slow to even consider even bothering to play on the X18S. It turns out that in some cases, tweaking some settings can eliminate the slowdown, and it's even possible to get a game that was unplayable to a fairly playable state. Now, just to temper expectations a little, it doesn't make these games perfect. There may still be audio issues, frame stutters, and general slowdown, but as you will see in the videos, in many games, the gameplay essentially goes from something like 10 FPS to 25 to 30 FPS, or something to that effect, and that makes it very playable. I'll be using the emulator MMJR version 2 in this video. You can get MMJR via its GitHub page, and I'll leave a link below. MMJR is a variant of the Dolphin emulator and has a lot of similarities with it. In general, I think MMJR performance is better, but you do need to have both Dolphin and MMJR and try both to see which works best. In MMJR, before you launch a game, there's a drop-down menu that leads to settings. These are what I would call system settings or global settings, which will stay the same even when you change the game. Now, you can also long press down on the game itself to bring up another menu, and you can change system settings for the game itself. This is probably the best way to do it. There's also an in-game settings menu, and these are settings that can be adjusted on the fly. There are less options here in the in-game settings, so some settings must be adjusted before you start the game. For each game listed here, I've started from the default system settings. You can take a photo or a screen grab of the default settings to remember what they are. If you ever change your default system settings, you can just go into the Files app under the MMJR directory, config and delete the dolphin.ini and gfx.ini files, which will give you the default settings again. One more thing I want to mention, I've used the Vulkan backend for the games tested in this video, but you can try changing to OpenGL if you want. I found Vulkan to have better performance in general. Alright, let's go through some games. In Wind Waker, there was heavy slowdown in the forest section that made it a struggle to play through. The game would drop down to the low teens for the frame rate. You can fix this by going into the in-game settings and turning on the settings Store EFB copies to textures only and immediately present XFB on. I found that the game played great after this. While this setting doesn't fix all the slowdown in the game, it does help the forest section. Avalanche 1080 has some slowdown and stutters that is pretty noticeable during gameplay with the default settings. Before you start the game, go to the settings, general, and turn audio stretching on. During the game, you can turn Store EFB copies to textures only and immediately present XFB on, and also emulated CPU clock speed to 75%. Don't forget to tick the option on as well, and a lot of the slowdown will be eliminated. There is still some frame rate stutters, but it will be a much better experience. In Hunter the Reckoning, the game is really slow at default settings. This is an easy fix, and all you have to do is set the emulated CPU clock speed at 50% and the game plays a lot faster after this. Baldur's Gate performance at stock settings was so bad that I categorized this as not working previously. I'm pleased to report that if you adjust the settings, the game plays okay. It still feels a little slow, but it's playable for the most part. First, before booting the game, go to Settings, General, and turn on Audio Stretching. Next, go to Enhancements and turn off the following settings: Scaled EFB Copy, Forced 24-bit Color, and Arbitrary Bitmap Detection off. In the in-game settings, turn on Immediately Present XFB and Emulator CPU Clock Speed to 35%. You can play around with this value and try 40%, but I was happy with 35%. For Prince of Persia on default settings, the game has quite a fair bit of slowdown, especially during the combat scenes. Before starting the game, go to Enhancements, turn off Scaled EFB Copy, Forced 24-bit Color, and Arbitrary Bitmap Detection. In-game, I found turning on EFB copies to textures only and Immediately Present XFB to help a lot. Adjusting the emulated CPU clock speed doesn't really help that much here. With Need for Speed Underground, the game was really slow on default settings and it was pretty unplayable. However, if you adjust some settings, the game can run really well and almost at full speed. Before starting the game, in Enhancements, turn off Scaled EFB Copy, 24-bit Color, and Arbitrary Bitmap Detection. In the in-game settings, set the emulated CPU clock speed to 70% and turn on Immediately Present XFB. You can try 65% to 75% as well, depending on the speed you like. At 65%, it plays a little faster, but appears to skip a frame or two, and at 75%, it looks like there's less frame skip, but it feels a little slower. Tony Hawk 3 is one that is really difficult to emulate properly. It's still not quite perfect after adjusting settings, but it's a little bit more playable. The best settings for this game are as follows. Before starting the game, go to Settings, General, and turn Audio Stretching on and turn it to 100. In Enhancements, turn everything off. In Hacks, turn everything on except for Ignore Format Changes and GPU Texture Decoding. Turn those off. Now, once you're in-game, in the in-game menu, use an emulated clock speed of 30%. Turn off Store EFB copies to texture only. One thing you'll have to note is that after making these fixes, the intro videos don't display, so just press A or Start to bypass them. In Splinter Cell, there was some slowdown with just the default settings, however with a couple of fixes the game runs pretty well. In the in-game menu, turn on Store EFB copies to texture only, and use an emulated CPU clock speed of 50%. For Eternal Darkness, there was some pretty bad slowdown during the combat on default settings. However, if you use an emulated CPU clock speed of 75% and turn on Immediately Present XFB, the game runs really well. In fact, the game runs almost at a locked 60 FPS everywhere. Finally, we have Medal of Honor, European Assault, and this game is pretty playable on default settings, though there is a bit of slowdown in some of the more demanding scenes where there's a lot of enemy AI going on. Fortunately, this is a pretty easy fix. You can use an emulated CPU clock speed of 75% and this will reduce some of the slowdown. While the FPS will still drop, the game still holds up and feels pretty smooth. I should also mention Call of Duty Big Red 1 and Medal of Honor Frontline don't work at all on the X18S, so European Assault is one of only a few options when it comes to first-person shooters on the GameCube. Also, this is a way better game than the PSP Medal of Honor Heroes. That's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed that look at tweaking some settings in MMJR to get more GameCube games to run. And if you did, leave a like, subscribe to my channel for more gaming videos, and I'll see you in the next one.